So welcome back. We're almost there. Almost. This is our last module. Yay! I'm just as excited as y'all are, I promise. We're all maxed out. I mean, you're not maxed out like I am. You weren't up till 2 o'clock studying like me. But I was up till about 11 last night, making sure that everyone's test was graded so that y'all could have those this morning. Been super excited about everyone's test. Y'all got that math. I was real proud about that. It seemed crazy at first, like this is real hard. But when the time came, y'all rose to the challenge and overcame it. So kudos to y'all. Everyone killed the soil orders. I mean, I was super excited and proud about the test. So good job. You should give yourselves a big pat on the back for that. We're almost there. Okay. So this last module is going to be more about what my specialty is, which is fertility and fertilizers and those nutrients and how those are going to affect your plant growth. So everything up until this point has been really kind of the things that are going to affect your nutrient management, what your soil type is, what your soil structure is, and you can get that information from the soil orders. We know that we're going to have some organic matter in there and the role that that plays, and then the role of the microbes in order to do this nutrient cycling. That's their purpose. During the process of doing what they do, are you done, Brandon? Okay. During the process of doing what they do, they make this happen. All right? And so we may have some manipulation of our fertilizers and our fertilizer source, but having an understanding of what our soils are doing allows us to adjust our fertilizer or our nutrient management practices. Okay? But first, there were a couple of things that some people did miss on the test, and I noticed this consistently. There were only about 3 or 4 things. I want to go over these real quick. So, identifying the correct soil order from the following grape groups. And so, this formative element gives me an indication of what that soil order is, just from looking at the name. I can look at it and go, that's a mollisol, or that is a spodosol, or it's an enthosol, or it's an alphasol or an oxisol. And so it is this little formative element that gives me an indication as to what soil order those soils belong to. Some people were using haplo or zero or fragio. That's not the soil order. And remember, just a couple of questions prior to this, I asked you what the 12 soil orders were. So just some of those things. Like, it's really hard for me to not let you out of this class and not know at least this. It's kind of like knowing the difference between sheep and cow, horse. What else do y'all have in animal science? And chickens, right? And to know the difference in those things. I was a little iffy on this one because on the quiz, I actually made the error, and the answer on the quiz was that both of these organisms digest very resistant, stable organic matter. Sarah's looking at me like, yeah, that was. But because some people answered this twice, it tells me that you're studying the quizzes and not the notes. Also, some people were kind of a little off on, like, the simple compounds are broken down by bacteria. Sugars and simple proteins broken down by bacteria. This one is going to be important when we move forward. This carbon to nitrogen ratio, 24:1 is like the middle. So the range does go from 20:1. Took all my markers. Anyhow, we're going to go over this here shortly, like probably Wednesday. The carbon to nitrogen ratio, 24:1 is like the medium. That's like balanced. There's no net gain or loss. So 24:1 is an important number to remember. Did anybody else have any questions about anything on the exam that was kind of like, hey, this was a little iffy or off or anything like that? No? Cool. As you move forward in agriculture, you're going to hear about this 4R nutrient stewardship. So a while back we were having problems with eutrophication. We're applying triple 13 just like for whatever, because that's the way Grandpa always did it. And now we have some problems and we have some pollution in our waterways, and we're like, we need to figure out a way to stop that, because it's very easy to be proactive about that than it is reactive. So I asked my soil and water conservation class, how would you go about fixing a lake that has that green algae in it that's like real nasty, kind of like a pool that had been sitting there for a while? Y'all know the color? Ugh. How would you go about fixing that? What's that?
Did you say like the green color? Like
Yeah.
I guess it'd be the pH of it.
All right, so one way might be the pH, and remember that this nutrient that are going in there are feeding the bacteria and the algae. That's why the color's green. Can we just dump a bunch of bleach in the lake like we do a pool? That's not cool either, is it? Right? And then we have a real big problem. Dr. Murdoch's mad at me because I've dumped 1 million gallons of bleach in this water system. So like, how do you go about fixing those things? And those might be some things you encounter. I don't know. That's the thing. We don't know. There are some steps that we can take, but the best one that we can take is make sure that we're good with our nutrients. How about we just not add them into the water? And that means applying less fertilizer and still getting the same response. So that's going to be kind of this primary focus, understanding what the nutrients are doing in the soil so that we can keep them in the soil, not in the water. And I'm probably going to ask y'all this about 13 more times before the end of the semester. So 4R nutrient stewardship is applying the right source, at the right time, at the right rate, and putting it in the right place. And so to start with here, we've been taking these soil samples so we know the right rate to put out, right? And I've been kind of giving you the source of fertilizer to use. It's kind of the only one we got. During this portion of the module, we'll talk a little bit about the right time and also about the right place. In a pasture situation, we're typically going to broadcast triple 13, right? Or some fertilizer, some triple something. Just because it's got all the nutrients and it's real quick and easy. It's not making us much money anyhow. But what it is doing is putting too much phosphorus out and it's going into the lake. Or maybe we're putting 2 tons of chicken litter out per acre. And what you don't think about is that it's a lot, isn't it?
Your nitrogen's gonna lead away.
Well, it all depends.
What is it in the chicken litter at that time? Is it nitrogen?
The phosphorus.
Phosphorus.
Then it'll get a buildup on it and then it'll grow anything.
And then it won't grow anything. So I just want y'all to think about this, kind of this, going back to this math problem. So chicken litter probably has a guaranteed analysis of triple 3. And so if you put out 1 ton of chicken litter, how many pounds of P2O5 did you apply?
1 ton of chicken litter.
1 ton of chicken litter. If you put 2,000 pounds of chicken litter out at 3% P2O5, how much P did you put out? P2O5. 2,000 times 0.03. Pull your phone out and do the math. I don't expect you to be a mental calculator. You're not a Rain Man. 60 pounds. You put 60 pounds of P2O5 out in 1 ton of chicken litter, and we're going to spread 2 pounds of chicken litter. So it's cool with the nitrogen. That's 120 pounds and 2 tons per acre, right? That's pretty good. We're also putting 120 pounds of P2O5 out there. And that P2O5 is running off into the lake, and that's what's causing the environmental problems. So knowing your nitrogen and those fertilizing calculations, you can kind of go, hey, you know what? You kind of add into some pollution here, and that's where we get that eutrophication. How do you fix that? You'd think they'd have it already figured out by now, right? Because there are people out there that are much smarter than me. Their whole job is to figure this out. And they haven't yet. So our best job is to minimize the nutrient loss. So we want to make sure that we're applying that at the right time. So not just putting all of your fertilizer up front. I grow my research focused on growing corn. And you grow corn on sandy soils. So if you put 200 pounds of nitrogen in April, guess what happens? You get 9 inches of rain that just washed all your fertilizer either in the lake or down or through the profile. Yeah. Guess what you got to do now? Wait for it to dry out, then go apply 200 more pounds because you lost it all. So you apply a little bit up front, and then you apply a little bit later on when the plant actually needs it. I'll go over this. And then applying it at the right place. And that's broadcast versus, maybe an abandoned application right near the plant. So some of the goals that we have are going to be plant production. We want to conserve our nutrient resources, our nutrient budgets. That's kind of what we've been going with. As you move forward, I think most of y'all are ag business, so y'all might not run into this unless you have to take like forages or something, maybe a crop production class, but eventually we can actually account for all of the nutrient gain and loss. We know that we put 120 pounds of nitrogen in. We know what the soil test was before. We know how much we're going to remove from the crop. And if it's not in the soil, and it's not in the crop, where's it at? Down in the lake or whatever. It's a real simple budget. We put it in, the crop uses some, the soil takes some, whatever else runs off into the lake. So knowing what you're putting out there is going to help you budget that. Knowing what your soil can hold. That's why CEC is so important. Again, you wouldn't want to apply 200 pounds of nitrogen on a CEC, on a soil with a CEC of 15. It can't hold it. Small cup versus big cup. So knowing that soil type is going to help you be able to figure out a better nutrient budget and how to go about making that nutrient management plan. So if you were like next semester in the 3000 level class, they will take my soil fertility hopefully in the spring or maybe next fall or whichever, and that's what we do in that class, in case if you're interested in fertilizers. And it's ultimately going to be about soil quality and productivity. I guess for me, this is kind of like, I can get a lot of energy by eating a bag of Skittles. If I need that energy, I can get it by eating a bag of Skittles. Or, I used to drink 6 bangs a day. A day. Is that healthy? No. And I knew that, but I was still doing it because I needed to be productive. Eventually, it became a negative. So it's the same thing with our fertilizers. We can put all the nutrients out there, and you can keep forcing this crop in your soil to do this thing, but eventually, it wears it out. It's like leaving your computer on all the time. Eventually, the parts wear out. So nutrient management, we need to make sure that we're having a productive soil, and by just driving it crazy and just making it do this thing that it's just not designed to do, eventually it wears out. It's deteriorated. So these nutrient budgets are going to come into play with that so that you can have a long-lasting soil productivity. Or just like getting a new car. If I drive it at 70 miles an hour all the time, it's going to blow up eventually. I need to change the oil. I need to make sure, there are some things I need to do. So it's maintenance of that. agriculture gets this very bad rap as being environmental pollution because they know that we're putting these nutrients out there. And once we kind of place them in that environment, then we know that we're getting 9 inches of rain. I mean, it only makes sense that that's going in the lake. It's not like we can defend ourselves. We know that we just put a whole bunch of fertilizer out right before it rained. And then they go to take water samples right next to our farm and they say, guess where all your fertilizer is? We know that it came from your farm. They can't necessarily determine that it came from our farm. They can only make an inference. So the difference between point source and non-point source. Have y'all heard these terms before? Maybe from high school. Point source, there's a pipe going into a river. This is exactly where that waste comes out. And so my boss would tell me that the solution to pollution is dilution. And so if you have a pipe coming out going into a river, eventually it goes downstream and becomes less concentrated. So the solution to pollution is dilution. This nutrient management plan that you may be a part of, that's why I say you're the manager for a farm and the fertilizer manager, and you need to know how much is being put out. That nutrient management plan is going to help you promote that environmental stewardship. And if you're being good stewards of the environment and the EPA knows that, they leave you alone. So do the right thing before they tell you to do the right thing. We talked about the cover crops being some benefit that is going to increase infiltration, all these other things, but they also add nitrogen back to the soil. So this is one way that we can get a little credit. We can get a little free nitrogen by planting these cover crops. And so it might cost you a little bit on the upfront because you got to pay for the seed, you got to take the labor and the time, the machinery costs, but they provide so much more benefits back that you don't necessarily get a immediate return from. And one of the things that you're going to face in your careers is that producers want to turn around this year, not 3 years from now. I can't afford to lose 3 years to finally start gaining in year 4. So there's got to be a way to offset some of that. And, we were at a meeting the other night with a congressman, and this is kind of what he was saying, was that there's got to be this way that we can give these producers some money now to get them through until they implement these practices so that they can then start making money while still being sustainable. So that becomes economic and environmentally sustainable. It's not necessarily about the yield as it is about the input. And farmers are prideful people, and their egos need to be stroked, and they want to have the best field that gets the most yield, and they'll put whatever they can into it just to beat Douglas Farms. They don't care. Tired of Douglas winning every year at the elevator. Throw the nutrients to it. We're about to get them this year. Right? So it's not always about the end goal, it's about the inputs. If I don't have to put as much money in, I actually get a net profit. So when you talk to your producers, ask them if they want to be right or if they want to be rich. Conservation tillage is a big thing. Putting the buffer strips up to minimize soil erosion. This will be kind of like at the end of the module. And then moving into soil and water conservation, which I'm teaching this semester. And then forest stand management, because everything happens from the top down. And so forests are typically on the top of the hill. And so if we clear cut that soil erosion is going to take all those nutrients away from that field or hillside and wash that down and then also into the creek. So there's a bunch of things that we need to be aware of when we're trying to implement these practices. Cover crops got a ton of benefits. I could have done 3 slides, 2 columns with all the benefits for cover crops. The most important thing is that we're going to have this low carbon to nitrogen ratio. When we have a low CN ratio, we're going to get a mineralization and we're going to get some credit back. Remember, 24-to-1 is the medium. And our cover crops should be less than 20-to-1 so that we get a net mineralization from this. Well, there are a lot of notes to take on this page. I didn't do that. You already did that. Cool. So glad. The different cover crop species, y'all, most of this stuff is online. You just got to dig for it a little bit. This information is typically going to be given out by your land-grant universities, your extension agents, the Sustainable Agricultural Research Education website. There are plenty of websites for you to go get the information that you need in order to implement a cover crop plan. And it might not be that y'all do that, but you'll work with someone who does, and that's part of the budget for ag business, things like that. So some of the common ones that we use, ryegrass, clover, and hairy vetch. These are going to be at least the clover and the hairy vetch and the alfalfa are going to be very low carbon to nitrogen ratios. The thing to know about conservation tillage is going to be that at least 30% of that soil needs to be covered. And so it's not necessarily that it's always no-till, but that there might be some strip-till. And I typically don't have very good luck playing videos from PowerPoint slides, but basically this strip-till machine only tills the row. It tills in strips. And so to keep your field as no-till, right. So it just stays no-till all winter. And then the hardest thing about no-till is planting into it. Sometimes your seed doesn't make it in because there's trash in the way, right? We call it trash. There's a corn stalk or something and you're planting in the same row and you're just never going to get that seed pattern right. And so what it does is there's a little basket in the tilling machine that just tills just this strip and then they plant right behind it. So you're only tilling this 6-inch strip where you're putting your plants. The rest of the field stays in no-till, which is what we want. For those of you who have a conservation interest, buffer strips are going to be something that you can implement that is going to slow water movement off of your field in this no-till situation, conservation till. And it will also trap some of the sediments that might be eroded, and it will also take up some of those nutrients. Just another look at kind of how those work. We'll have some sedimentation where that soil settles out because it slows the water flow down. And then the crops will end up taking up some of those nutrients as well. For forest stand management, we want to minimize those losses. And that's difficult to do. Like Dr. Beth showed me a video this morning, and all the water that was in the creek up at Oakley Farm was all looked like. I mean, you could tell there was a lot of clay in it. It was red. There's sometimes we just can't stop that, because how do you stop runoff from a hill? Some soil is going to make it, right? You just don't. But if we can keep our forest there, we'll slow the rainfall down. This is that intersection that we talked about back in Module 2. Everyone good here? So avoiding that soil disturbance, and man, let's just not cut all of our trees down at one time. Right? And you know, that kind of makes sense to us, but doesn't make sense to the big company that's trying to harvest that timber and make a profit off of it. So they've had to readjust their strategy and figure out new ways to go about selecting, harvesting their trees so that they're also being good stewards of the environment. Anybody heard of this before? If you haven't, go ask Dr. Fenwell. He'll talk to you about regenerative agriculture. I've yet to delve into this regenerative agriculture kind of concept, going with sustainability. But man, this makes sense to me. This is minimizing the soil disturbance, growing some crops, different crops to increase biodiversity, keep your soil covered, and then keep that root system there all year long. That's why we plant cover crops. So kind of in the middle is everything that I do. That's my goal as a agronomist, is to make an agronomy and soil scientist. Integrating the livestock, that's where it takes the left turn, and I don't see you putting livestock in a 200-acre corn operation. I don't know, but in the pasture situation, so I'm having to switch gears because y'all don't grow corn around here. Not much in Putnam County. Nope. Shot my whole research program. So I'm having to learn a different strategy. Just kind of a simple concept. Back in the 1840s and 1850s, when they didn't have anything else to do, they were sitting around writing all their stuff on paper. They were conducting experiments and using the scientific method. And ultimately what this is showing is that your yield is proportional to the lowest limiting factor. And at first they just thought it was nutrients. So you can only get as much yield as, let's say, the level of phosphorus. If phosphorus is low and everything else is high, you're only going to make whatever the yield would be for the level of phosphorus that you have. Until you increase the phosphorus level, it doesn't matter what you do to any of the others, because you're still low in phosphorus. That's like the standard fundamental concept of soil fertility. But it also goes with water, because you can take a soil test in the desert or in a arid area, and all the soil tests can come back great. If you don't have no water, the nutrients don't make it into the plant. You can have all the water and all the nutrients, but if you don't have any sunlight, plants don't grow because they can't do photosynthesis. So those are kind of higher level concepts. Like when you get up to that, that's going to be soil fertility, and then moving into advanced degrees. We want to make sure that we're applying this fertilizer kind of at the right place. So the difference between broadcast or a banded application, maybe if you're in an ornamental situation and you apply a foliar application. So y'all remember how mean I was about the pot problem? Instead of doing that, they actually have to calibrate and figure out how much nutrient to put in one spray. That's me. That's a Dr. Earhart kind of, how much nutrient needs to go in actual one spray on this foliar plant. And you're doing it with a backpack. So now you've got to calibrate a whole, it can get complicated. Just to kind of look at where you might run into and use broadcast applications, a pasture situation is going to be one of those. Maybe it's that you don't have the equipment for a banded application. We can't fix that, I'm sorry. I mean, my budget only allows for me to have a cone spreader. That's the best I can do right now. Okay, what kind of measures can I take to minimize some of these losses to volatilization? And that's what they're teaching you to do here, is how do you adapt to a certain situation? You can't change that farm, that farmer's equipment. It's all they got. So you'll have to figure out some other way to minimize these losses. This is going to be probably next week that we're going to go over this nitrogen cycle in a very just kind of general way. If you were to take fertility, we would go over this in a very specific way. But just, this is the most complicated cycle that we have going on. It's also the most important one because nitrogen is what makes plants grow. This is that volatilization loss that you might have in a pasture situation, where you apply a broadcast application of, let's say, urea 4600, and it's in the wrong environment. You applied it at the wrong time of year, and you lost 30% of your nitrogen. So you applied 100 pounds, 30% of it went off into the atmosphere, and now you're left with 70. But you paid for 100. Ouch. And you didn't get the response. So not only did you lose on the fertilizer end of it, you also lost on the yield end of it. That's a double whammy. Damn it. What am I going to do? So there are some things that you can do in order to minimize some of those losses by knowing 4R nutrient stewardship. And there are a couple of other chemical options to minimize that. This localized placement is typically like a starter fertilizer application. We kind of knife that fertilizer into the soil so that we don't have those losses from being exposed to the environment. We got a few different types. Surface dribble, point injection, drip irrigation, or fertigation. Not like these are going to be big test questions, just that these are some options for localized placement. So we will put a band of fertilizer a little bit below the surface. Our seed, we're going to put a band of fertilizer application, fertilizer a little bit below the surface. Our seed will germinate and those roots will start to grow to that. This fertilizer will also start to diffuse out into the region where the roots are growing into. So we're kind of manipulating, when we know where the fertilizer is going to go, we can put it in a specific spot so that the plant gets it first, not the 9 inches around. And then you may be able, you might not have a knife application, but you might have the possibility that you could apply a surface dribble. Maybe you don't have coulters. Has anybody used any knife injection fertilizer? It's mostly just cone. Okay. Anybody drip irrigation, horticulture? Nope. Okay. Pretty cool setup. That's going to be expensive, but it's going to supply the exact right of nutrients to the plant at all times. You minimize any losses, and the plant's not going to lose out on any of that fertilizer. If you can get away from doing foliar application, don't do it. Applying that at the right time is really meeting the plant nutrient demand. And so, from a human standpoint, in the beginning of a child's life, they need a lot of nutrients, right? But they can't necessarily eat solid food. And then there comes a point in time in our lives where we're like, I don't want to eat, I just want to play. And then, especially if you're a boy, when you get to be about teenage years, like, you don't have to worry about leftovers. Mom just feeds you everything and you just eat that, right? My guys know what I'm talking about. I was the guy. They were like, oh, give it to Mikey, he likes it, he'll eat anything. So my mom just shoved all that off on me. If I give you food right after you've eaten or you're not hungry, are you going to eat it? No, because you're hungry, right? Doesn't matter what it costs you. I just don't want to eat it. But if I keep food from you while you're hungry, so you want to make sure that you're applying those nutrients to the plant when they're hungry for it. They might not be ready to take it up. They might not be old enough to take that up. The root system isn't developed enough, and they don't need that much nutrient because they're still just growing. They're this big. You don't need a whole lot of food when you're 4. You need a lot of food when you're 14. Your body is growing. So again, because I work in a lot of corn, we will apply a little bit of fertilizer in the beginning of the year to get it through until it starts to grow here. But right here, it's getting hungry again. Somewhere around, the end of May, beginning of June, I need some more food. I've already used up all the nitrogen. Feed me. So we want to make sure that we're applying just a little bit in the beginning to get it through until it's old enough and ready enough to take that up right before it gets into the reproductive phase. And we're also going to want to do this to coincide with losing losses to the environment. You don't want to put all your fertilizer on up front because you're going to end up losing it to rainfall. And so that's why knowing what your soil type is and what the soil texture is going to help you know when and when not to apply those fertilizers. How many more do I got? I think we should be getting close. The best way to know that, one is going to be to take your pre-plant soil samples, which we've already done. You'll want to make sure that you're taking plant tissue samples in the middle of the year and also your soil samples. So that way you can determine the budget, what's there, what the plant needs, and then you can apply the right amount of fertilizer. Soil variability. We're going to take soil samples from 6 to 12 inches, depending on what nutrient we're looking at. You're going to take those at least pre-plant because you're about to apply fertilizer and you need to know. But you can also take them post-harvest in order to determine what your budget was. There's a ton of different extraction types. This is probably more so for my 3000 level in soil fertility. But just to understand that when you send that off to the lab, there are different regions that require different extractants. That's probably going to be more for your field agronomist. Your soil scientist might know that a little better, might not have a problem. We went over soil test reports, so this is almost right in line in time with what we were doing in lab. Y'all feel confident about how to read a soil test report? Yep. And then finally, the right rate. You can typically find some recommendation. The lab will send a recommendation back as well. I guess one of the recommendations that we had for corn in Mississippi is 1.3 pounds of nitrogen for every bushel we hope to gain. So if you want 200 pounds or 200 bushels times 1.3, you mean like 260 pounds of nitrogen. Now y'all might see this in ag business. Dr. Best or Dr. Park might talk about this, maybe even Mr. Campbell. There is this law of diminishing returns. So nutrient applications or any type of marketing input or any type of, at some point, it's not linear. So every dollar that I put in does not return $3 back. Every dollar that I spend on marketing or every dollar that I spend on fertilizer, every other pound of nitrogen that I put out, at some point, that declines. So just because I want 400 bushels of corn doesn't mean that I can put out 520 pounds and I'm going to get that. There's a curve. At some point, I can only put so much more money into this thing. And so having an understanding of that from soil fertility helps you know what? We're good. I cannot put any more. I cannot get any more out of this. And then finally, the right source. Again, this is leading into fertility. We've been working with some of these fertilizers all semester. The 4600, there's our concentrated superphosphate, and our muriate of potash. Those are going to be the three. Your phosphorus material is going to be a little different, but those are going to be the main three fertilizer sources that you use. That's it for today. Thank y'all so much for showing up. I will tell you that the people here, I can see your test grades as a result of your attendance. Does that make sense? Like, you know how they say that if you show up to class, you're probably going to make a better grade? I can look at all of your grades and go, that's because they show up to class. So your hard work is paying off.